Hello, everyone. I'm here with my guest today. Who wants to talk to me about the religious implications related to UAP. I'm going to let my guest introduce himself and welcome. Please let everyone know who you are and a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Deb. My name is Moshe Gersht. I live in a suburb of Jerusalem. I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I'm a spiritual teacher. Born and raised in LA in a Jewish family. When I was 20 years old, I had a spiritual awakening, and I moved to Jerusalem, where I studied Torah in depth for about a decade and a half. I'm an ordained rabbi, but I teach spiritual universal principles from Torah that cross the of psychology and general spirituality. And it's my pleasure to be here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, what would you say the Torah or your religious research so far has taught you about the subject of UAPs? How does it correlate to you?
Well, I don't know if there's anything extremely specific in Torah and Jewish background that speaks to the nature of UAPs like explicitly, uh, but there are certainly elements within the Torah that don't preclude the idea that there could be life outside of Earth or in other dimensions. In fact, I would say explicitly we speak about non-human intelligence, right? Whether that's angels or other beings that don't live on the same plane, right, on the material plane that we do. And certainly, if you ascribe to a God figure, that is also a non-human intelligence. So, um, UAP is an interesting conversation because it both includes the technology of whatever the UAP is, if we're dealing with craft and the like, and if we're dealing with beings, um, if that's the case. So, from a Torah perspective, there's nothing that says it isn't there. The question is, is there anything explicit that says there is? There might be one area that I feel is points in that direction a little bit more right in the beginning of Genesis, where it discusses the Nephilim, which are these giants or fallen beings that are, connecting with humans, as the verses say, and that's an interesting piece which requires explanation. But outside of that, I don't think you see anything extremely specific in Torah that points to, flying crafts or even or submersibles.
Okay, so there's just a general sort of nod to non-human intelligence without it being laid out other than potentially the Nephilim. Okay,
Yeah,
to
I
sum
think
it up.
so. I mean, I think one could make an argument that the Nephilim are pointing in that direction, and I could understand that argument for sure. Um, there was a very very well-known, well-respected rabbi in the 20th century in America, named Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was also referred to as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he had many, many, many followers, and to this day, they're all over the world. And one of them worked for NASA on a project where they were investigating potential life outside of Earth, and he had mixed feelings about it. And when he wrote in to this Rebbe, who's the Hasidic leader, and he wrote in saying that, I have mixed feelings about this. Should I be doing this? Am I allowed to do this? And he wrote back saying, not only are you allowed, but you should be looking, because if you don't believe in a God that could create life outside of Earth, you're limiting God.
Do you think that's the general belief from Judaism that this would be limiting God to not accept that there could be other non-human intelligence?
Well, I can't
Do you
speak
think
for I can't
yeah,
speak
that's
for the whole Jewish faith, but
that's what I
what
was
I,
thinking.
yeah, what I can say is I think that you're going to find a lot of open-mindedness. Um, Certainly for those who spend time deeply in the literature, the whole basis of Torah and Jewish literature is based on questioning and allowing for the question, and keeping an open mind to the fact that we don't have all the answers, and that there's a lot that's given, and that there's a lot to seek for and to find out. And there's a depth to reality that goes way beyond the surface of what we can see with our eyes, and that's clear. So I think given enough time and you know, and people enough awareness as to what it is they're looking for and what it is they're trying to keep an open mind for, I think you would see that. I still think we're at a stage where I don't think, putting religion aside, I don't know if the majority of people, whether they're Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, or any faith, I still don't think most people are yet aware of the subject matter in general. So it would be curious to see if you took this into a room full of people who were studying, and then you brought up the question, what would come out.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask if anyone has ever come to you seeking guidance on this topic as it becomes more public.
Yeah, certainly. I would say there's a handful of students that have reached out privately, and they just want to know more as they see headlines in the news. And I've done a lot of research myself, as well as spoken to people who are far more knowledgeable and far more advanced than I am in the subject. And I find, interestingly, a lot of the people who are, I would say more advanced, certainly older than me, and have spent more time studying, they're not as interested. They're more like, when they land and they're speaking to us, then we'll have a conversation about it. But they don't see it as a contradiction. They just don't see it as particularly pertinent or relevant yet. But I think for people who are younger, maybe more exposed to what's going on in the world today, if people are following what's happening in the news and certainly in the back channels of this whole subject, there's a lot going on in there, and you want to know, well, does this fit? Like, where do we fit in the universe? And from everything that I've learned, I would say not only is it not go against religion, I mean, it is fully in alignment with the idea that if you're dealing with an infinite being, an infinite creative force, why not? We know that there's, right? If you go back a couple hundred years, all we have are 8 planets in the solar system, or maybe 7, depending on how you're counting. And now we know that we're dealing with hundreds of billions and trillions, right? We know how vast the universe is, and we don't even know how vast the universe is. So aside from likelihood, I mean, it would be hard to imagine a God that creates just this. And if we are the only life in the universe, that just speaks to the nature of how special it is to be human.
Right. I think that some people have made the argument that the Old Testament said, and I think that's also reflected in the Torah, that we were created in the image of God. That doesn't mean we were the only beings created, because obviously cows are not necessarily like us, right? But they're not in the image of God per se, but they exist. They are alive. They were created by God, right? Is that
Sure.
a correct way of seeing it?
Yeah, well, I would say, when we understand the image of God, of course, we're not dealing with the corporeality, the physical nature of what it means to be human, because that is to say that God was a human. The depth behind that, when you look at the mystical sources and the Zohar, Kabbalah, Hasidus, um, what you're going to find is to be made in the image of God means to be made in a certain spiritual alignment where we have the power to impact reality, to affect and co-create in this world. That life is an energetic balance that we get to be a part of, and our free will is part of that experience called being made in the image of God. And once you come onto that, so that includes anything and every being that would have an intelligence, certainly if it has a higher intelligence than us, that it's likely also made in that image, or something close to it.
I'm excited about that because it could have been a linguistic error, right? And there's lots of linguistic errors that people argue about in the scripture. So,
Sure.
it, so it could have meant that, for instance, having consciousness and having spirit and having the ability to create was what they meant. That's the way we followed God. Is that what you're
True.
implying?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's certainly what the mystical sources speak to. When you look at the depth of what it means to be made in the image of God, it's not speaking about the fact that we've got arms and legs and we've got eyes and a nose, but it's speaking about our depth, our power to co-create, our power to choose. It's an energetic relationship, and in addition to that, there's a meta structure to reality, right? Across many different faiths and spiritual cultures, there's an idiom or an idea that the universe is a big man and man is a small universe. right? That we reflect one to the other, that the universe is fractal in that way. And so we're all made in the image of this great, unified, systematic structure being that we call God. And the whole universe is made in that reflection.
Okay, so I wanted to jump back a little bit. Earlier, you were commenting that it's a lot of the younger people who are more curious about what's going on. So do you think the bigger issue is more not religion, but the generational interest? Like maybe perhaps that the younger people are a little bit more open-minded, have seen some wild things and like, AI cars and really cool phones and things like that. Might and movies, right? So, is it possible that that would be the bigger issue rather than religious implications?
I wouldn't say so, because when I speak to an older, I'm in my mid 30s, so when I speak to people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, I mean, people have been excited about. If you're excited about this topic, if this is something that speaks to you, it's been speaking to you, could be for your whole life. I know that this is something that speaks to my mother. I know it's something that speaks to a good friend of mine who I spoke to last week. He's 68. So I don't think it's generational in that regard, but I think when you combine the two together, I think when you combine religion and age, then you get to an interesting nexus, or I would say, like a bridge between two levels of open mind. Where I think if you had a more religious orientation, um, which is more conservative in nature and therefore wants to fit to a certain structure, and you were born at a time where that was the way things were. So then I do believe you might find more of a closeness, not necessarily, but that's my intuition tells me that. And from when I speak to people, the people that are speaking to me happen to be younger. They also are religious. Um, when you go outside the religious community, I think it does, the generational gap doesn't necessarily hit as hard, because people from all generations. If you're interested in it, you're interested in it. If you want to know, you want to know. I wasn't particularly interested in this until 2017, when the Linguistic story broke in the New York Times, and I started following what happened. I mean, I had my own experience when I was 18, but I kind of buried that somewhere within until it started becoming normal and more popular to discuss.
Right. So I wanted to address when it comes to religion, people tend to think that it stays really much the same every year, right? Like the people stick with the same traditions and they don't really adjust or reform. But I think that's a falsehood. I think it is true that with time, religion adapts. Religion, changes their services. They change certain ways they approach things. They try to adjust with the times. And do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I can speak for Judaism to a certain degree. I can't speak for other faiths and religions, though I imagine there's something similar. I know that when it comes to the world of Torah and Orthodoxy, there are certain things that cannot be moved, and then there's everything else that is adaptable, right? So um, the idea that there's a Sabbath, and Orthodox Jews, they keep Shabbat, there's going to be at least 39 different things that they're not going to do every Saturday. That's not going to move, right? Barring, life-threatening situations and things of that nature. But when it comes to science, so it's explicit all over the place that, you have the science of your day, and science develops. And if you relied on the science from 300 years ago, we wouldn't be driving in the cars we have today if we relied on the science from 1,000 years ago. So you would still think that the Earth was at the center of a very small thing called a very small universe. So certainly, the way that we look at the world, our perspectives, that's adaptable. Certainly, the way that we dress and the way that certain things are expressed are adaptable to the times and to the places that we're in. And then there are going to be other elements that are not movable, and that's what makes a religion, right? Religion comes from the word to relegate, and to create a law around, and so there's going to be a certain level of constriction there. But hopefully, if it's done the right way, what they're trying to preserve in the relegation is a spiritual connection, not so much to do with your perspective on reality. That's supposed to grow. It's always supposed to grow. We're in an evolutionary reality that's constantly in a state of growth. So that's what we're doing.
Okay, so yeah, I was just trying to put the pieces together of why some people might be having a hard time adapting. And I know, for instance, I was raised in the Catholic faith for some years. I didn't stay there very long, but I remember they changed a lot while I was there, and I'm like, I didn't know you were allowed to do that. Like they would make people kneel, and then they're like, no, you don't have to kneel anymore. Then they would make people wait for someone to come around to do the communion. Then they didn't do that anymore. Like you came up and multiple people could pass out the communion, right? So that's what I meant by things can just change. I don't know if they're like, how does that change come about? Who's the designated leader for making those decisions in Judaism? Do you have
So, I mean,
someone like that?
that's a great question, and I really appreciate that. In general, the way that Torah works, but there's different bodies of the Torah. So you're going to have elements of it that are more philosophical in nature, and then there are going to be what you and I would probably refer to as like the rules of the service and the spiritual practice of Judaism, and that is called halacha, and that is something that is also evolving over time as technologies develop, as people develop. And it's not any one individual, though there's always a handful of people in every generation who are just the most studied, the most righteous, the people who have been devout and dedicated to the study of Torah, and they have the mind to hold all the pieces. And when the big questions show up, so it comes to their doorstep, and they're the ones to deal with these major questions along the way. I remember about 15 years ago when I first started learning, there was a big topic on euthanasia and how whether or not you're allowed to do that. Like, is somebody allowed to pull the plug? Is that called murder or not? And that's an ethical question, but it's also a halachic question. And there was dispute amongst the top, 2 or 3 sage rabbis living here in Israel as well as in the United States. And that was fascinating to watch. So when you talk about really, really big things, so then there's like a top line of individuals. But beyond that, so long as a person has a level of depth and connection with the Torah, it's meant to be community by community. So you could be in 100 different communities. Today things are more structured because we're a couple thousand years later. But even still, as questions come up, the rabbi of a community has the authority to make a decision for that community. That's their job. And they may come to a different conclusion than a rabbi in a different community.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so one day I'm hoping you'll be that sage rabbi that people can come to help them and guide them. I'm giving you optimistic vibes on that one.
Um,
So I what do you think's going to happen like, I guess because there's so many different community leaders, it might be difficult to say this, but what do you think would happen, say the government does in the United States turns around and says, "Yes, we definitely 100% have NHI or, extraterrestrial slash interdimensional beings 100%. We have found them. We will show you guys pictures next week." What do you think the response will be, perhaps by some of those community leaders?
well, I think what you'll certainly see, again, assuming that it was confirmed and everybody knew this to be true, is that top tier that I mentioned before, which again is a handful of you know sage elders, in each major country, but certainly in Israel, in the United States. But everybody would come out with some form of statement, whether a verbal statement on a video or a written statement, more likely a written statement, so that they can put their thoughts together in a clear way and be preserved well in time. Everybody would have to address it as something major and real. I mean, if we're being honest, this is, outside of God revelation. This is the greatest story of humankind, right? The greatest story in history. Everybody has to have a thought on it, an opinion on it. The question is, what would they say? And I think the answer to that would very much depend on what exactly the revelation would be. Meaning, if the revelation is there's non-human intelligence that lives on a different dimension, and every now and then we see them, so that would beget a certain type of response. If we find out that we're part of a galactic organization of pigs and they're all over the place and we just don't see them, like that would certainly beget a different response. So I guess we're still dealing in theoretics over here. It's very theoretical because we don't know what they'd say. So just the fact that they would come out and say something is real, everybody would have to have a response on that. Uh, Depending on the nature of what was said, I think we'll hear different things.
It's interesting because I feel so tempted to ask, since you are in Israel, you are probably aware that one of the former Minister of Defenses came out from Israel and made some comments about a galactic federation. Have you heard any ripples about that? I just have to ask.
Right? You're referencing Chaim Eshed, and
Yes.
and I was very interested when he came out. I did look into it afterwards. I went out and I bought his biography that came out, I guess not long afterwards. Which, I guess there's a skeptic in me, which is like, okay, well, if he says something mind blowing and then puts out a book, it's a really good way to sell books. I didn't see anything particular in the book that actually spoke to that, so they seem to be two independent pieces. I tried to find him afterwards that I wanted to speak to him, just to, I try to be a good judge of character and listen to the way he says what he's saying. I couldn't find him afterwards, and I didn't hear anything afterwards, actually. I kind of felt that it fell what seemed to be deaf ears, despite the fact that he was clearly a very senior official in the Israeli space program. I thought that was interesting, but I don't know anything more.
It does seem he's gone silent. Everyone's gonna be like, "Hmm," right? And he's
Yeah,
far from the only person in a high position of authority who's made statements that are like that. And I think that that's something eventually will come back to everybody, "Oh, he said it, and he said it, and he said it." Like, I mean, we have had President Obama talking about it on, nightly TV, late night TV talking about these UFOs. So, eventually people are going to go, we should maybe be listening to these people, right?
yeah. I
Okay.
mean, look, I think recently Marco Rubio said something that I thought was brilliant and smart. And he said, "Look, one of two things are true. Either this is the biggest story in human history, or we've got incredible issues at the very top of the government everywhere." Right? Like one, and which is also one of the biggest stories in history. So one way or the other, right? This is something to be looked at to figure out what's happening. And if 100 people come forward and say the same story, either means there's something there or there's something wrong with 100 people. So we have to look it up.
Yes, I was listening to, I think his name is Boyd Bushman today, who worked for Lockheed Martin. I was re-listening to some of his interview, and he was convinced that he was being handed materials to examine at Lockheed Martin from UFOs. And it occurs to me, what if they did lie to him? Like, but who would do that? What would the motivation be? That would be so bizarre. Like, why would they tell him it was a UFO? Well, and what if that's what a lot of this comes from? But there's so many outside witnesses. In fact, one of the most phenomenal photos of a UFO was taken in Israel. The really large, bright orb. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I saw a video once where it was over the old city. There was an orb that had shot up. But no, I don't know of a photo. I'm unaware. If you sent me
Yeah,
that,
it
I'd
was
love to see
probably
it.
just a still of that video. But yeah, I'm
Okay.
just and I think someone recently from Israel commented on the need to really find out what's going on. So for people who are not aware, we do work quite a bit with Israel. I don't think they're technically one of the Five Eyes, but our Five Eyes are more like 10 eyes, anyway. So it's I know that like we were helping maybe with the space program and things like that too. So it's interesting, just listening to people from other countries say, yeah, we need to pay attention to this.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, because this is a global conversation, right? This is not,
yes.
bound to one country.
Absolutely, and it's wonderful to see how some of the other countries are handling it. For instance, Mexico, is working with their researchers within the government, and France is as well. So they're respecting their researchers and listening to them. And I think Brazil, had a Senate hearing that included a lot of really significant UFO researchers.
Hmm.
So hopefully all countries will heed what their researchers are saying. Yes, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah, amen.
Yes. So I have, of course, the concern that people who are in religious leadership are going to have to provide some form of counseling to their members. Some people would say congregation, community. When things change in the future, when things become a little bit more clear and significant, assuming the government becomes transparent or all governments become transparent. So, what would you advise to other people in your position for those leaders to do to help counsel?
Yeah, I think that, again, all based in the reality that, uh, assuming that this is at some point confirmed and corroborated as a reality, I think any person who takes life seriously, for me, I have always seen myself as a truth seeker. I care about the truth. I care about knowing what reality is, and that's going to impact everything that I think about and all the decisions that I make. So if this is becoming more and more of a potential reality for people, just because it's getting more attention, I would say if you're in a position of leadership, it's certainly worth becoming informed at the very least, and to learn more about the subject, so that if in your lifetime it becomes a more than just a conversation in the news, and now you have to deal with people who are having, uh, maybe some crisis of faith, that you're able to have that conversation with them. My personal feeling is, this wouldn't be a crisis in faith. This would be where if there were things share information and wisdom on the reality, because we have
I,
a big
unf-
question.
Unfortunately, the video froze for a moment. I think the last thing I heard was,
Can you hear me
in
now?
your opinion. Yeah, I hear you now. It was just frozen for a moment. I think it's because of a long, long distance. Maybe, who knows,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Um,
right.
um,
I would
but
say that the the aside from becoming informed about it, I mean, the big question that everybody would have to ask, regardless, is, well, even if there are non-human intelligence, um, where did they come from, and what's their purpose, and could they shed light on our purpose and the purpose in the universe? So, uh, nothing is exclusive. It could only help determine, what the truth of reality is.
and it sounds like there's a lot of scholarship, I'm trying to seek that out, and something that you're definitely on the path of trying to get those answers. So I guess my final question is, do you think Judaism will be okay in the face of the UFO NHI reality?
Oh yeah, I do. I
Okay.
think that everything is okay. Um, where if if you have to pin down what all of religion is about, it's living in alignment with what you ascribe to as the truth. And if the truth is more expansive than you thought, it just means that we need to catch up to a more expansive truth. So truth will prevail.
Thank you so much for coming today and sharing your insights and your point of view on this subject. Can you tell people where they can find you if they want to reach out?
Sure. You can find me at my website, which, like it's spelled over here, it's moshegersht.com, and all my information's over there.
Okay, I so appreciate everything that you've contributed today, especially the fact that you will be comforting people to know that Judaism will be fine. I hope more and more people will be coming on here to say, yes, our religions will be fine, because it seems to be this misconception and myth that everyone's going to fall apart. And I know that's not going to be the case. I think everyone's going to be okay. So thank you again so
Everyone's
much for
going to
coming
be
today.
fine.
Yes, it'll be fine.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Deb.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everybody who listened. Take care.